The cold didn't just come from the north that day. It didn't just howl through the dead cottonwoods or scrape its invisible claws against the homestead walls. The real cold was already inside. It had taken root in the silence between breaths, in the hard set of a man's jaw. It lived in the heart of Levi Wynne. Belle stood in the center of the room, her shoulders squared against a world that had suddenly shrunk to the size of this cold, dark parlor. Her hands were wrapped tight around a small bundle of linen. It was all that was left of her wedding linens, but no one in this house called her a wife anymore, not since Asa was buried. Levi's voice, always as flat and unforgiving as a river stone, cut through the quiet. "The boy's gone. What else is there to bind you to us?" She didn't answer. The tears had been burned out of her months ago, right around the time her husband Asa took his last rattling breath. She had been the only one to hold his hand. She had been the only one to wash his body. She had been the only one to carry him to his grave. Not Levi, not his own brother. Levi always said blood was thicker than water, but apparently it wasn't thicker than convenience. And now, with Asa in the frozen ground and the first hard frost sealing the earth like a tomb, she and the twins had become an inconvenience too great to bear. "Pa wouldn't have turned me out," she said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. Levi finally looked at her. He had a tight-lipped expression he always wore when he was doing something cruel but had convinced himself it was righteous. "Pa's gone. And my wife's tired of feeding mouths that ain't hers." Belle's gaze flickered past him, toward the kitchen doorway. Sadie Wynne stood there, her arms folded tight, a permanent bitterness etched into her face that no amount of Sunday prayer could ever rinse out. Sadie didn't even pretend to be righteous. She was just mean, plain and simple. The children, Joey and Elsie, stood silently behind Belle, their small hands clutching the rough fabric of her skirts. Their boots were already laced. They were only 5, but they understood. They understood the chill in the air had nothing to do with the weather. Belle took a small step forward, a final, desperate plea. "At least let them stay, just until the snow clears. They'll go with you." The bundle of linen in her hands dropped to the floor, forgotten. It made no sound. Levi nodded toward the front door. A single, flimsy crate sat on the porch. Inside was her entire life: a few cracked dishes, a half-empty jar of dried beans, a single moth-eaten quilt. The wind was already pulling at the blanket covering the crate, revealing the corner of Asa's old pocket Bible, its leather cover worn soft and smooth from his hands. A new, sharper cold pierced through her. "You're not even giving me a horse." Levi just shrugged, a gesture of absolute indifference. "We need them. It's a long winter coming." The world narrowed then. It became a long, dark tunnel of grief with no light at the end, just more darkness. She bent down, her fingers numb, and lifted the crate. The bone-deep ache of humiliation settled into her ribs, a new pain to join the others. Her children looked up at her, their faces pale and still. They weren't crying. They were just waiting for her to move, waiting for her to save them. She stepped out into the gray dusk. Snow was already beginning to fall, soft, mocking flakes that melted on her cheeks like icy tears. The sky was the color of iron and felt twice as heavy. Behind her, the door closed. It didn't slam. It just closed. A quiet, final sound, as if it had never been opened to her in the first place. And they walked. No one in the small, huddled town stopped them. No one offered a ride. She saw faces in the windows, curtains pulled back just enough to glimpse her shame before turning away. They were spectators at her funeral march. Mrs. Pringle, the storekeeper's wife, stood wrapped in her thick purple shawl as Belle passed the mercantile. She shook her head once, a slow, satisfied motion. "Told you she was bad luck," Belle heard her say to no one in particular, but to everyone. The words followed her, clinging to her back like burrs. She kept walking. Joey stumbled, his small legs unused to such a journey. He stumbled again. Belle scooped him up without breaking her stride, her back groaning under the sudden weight. Elsie clung to the side of her dress, her silence more terrifying than any scream. She was too quiet for a 5-year-old. The town blurred behind them, becoming a bad dream she was walking away from. The road ahead was a ribbon of slush and frozen mud. Her boots, thin and worn, were soaked through before they had even gone 2 miles. Her hands burned with the cold, then went numb. She didn't have gloves. Levi had kept them, said they were his paws. She kept one eye on the dark line of the horizon where the forest began. It looked like a row of jagged teeth against the dying light. Maybe there was shelter there, or at least a thick tree to lean against while she figured out how to die without letting her children freeze first. That was the only thought in her head now, a grim, terrifying calculation. By the time they reached the creek, the violet dusk had deepened into a starless black. The water wasn't fully frozen. It had a thin, treacherous crust of ice, like the last thread of her pride. It would not hold their weight. She eased the crate down beneath a leaning pine, its branches heavy with snow. She pulled out the moth-bitten quilt and spread it over the children. And that's when Joey finally broke. He started to cry, a weak, whimpering sound that shattered something deep inside her chest. She held him, then pulled Elsie in, wrapping her own thin shawl around their small, trembling bodies. She tucked them against her, trying to give them the last of her warmth. Her own breath was coming slower now. Her thoughts felt thick, woolen. The wind found them again, and this time, it had teeth. She pressed her lips to Joey's forehead. It was so cold. "If I sleep," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't let go." The children didn't answer. Their breaths mingled with hers, shallow and warm, but for how long? The snow was falling harder, a relentless white curtain erasing the world. She tried to pull the quilt tighter, but her hands wouldn't obey. They felt like blocks of wood. She looked up at the empty, churning sky. Somewhere in the great, silent dark above the pines, maybe Asa was watching. Or maybe not. She had no prayers left. Only apologies. "I tried, Asa, I tried." Her eyes fluttered closed. The quilt had pulled loose again in the wind. Elsie coughed, a dry, rattling sound, and curled deeper into her mother's coat. Belle reached for her, a clumsy, useless gesture. Her arm fell limp. And then something shifted, not in her body, in the world. A sound, a low, deliberate crunch through the snow. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was heavy, slow. It had a rhythm that was too steady for the wild. Her mind fought against the fog, against the sweet, heavy pull of sleep. The sound grew louder. Crunch, pause, crunch. Then a shadow fell over them. It was broad and tall and utterly still. With the last of her strength, she forced her eyes open. What she saw was not a man, not in the way she understood men from her town. This was a figure cloaked in thick furs, a mountain that moved. His face was half in shadow beneath a curtain of long black hair. His eyes were as dark and deep as pine bark. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just looked down at them, at this frozen little pile of misery, with something unreadable in his stare. Belle tried to push herself up, to shield her children, but her legs had no strength left. Her voice came out as a thin, pathetic squeak. "Please, don't hurt them." The giant figure knelt beside her. His hands were huge, the skin roughened by sun and marked with old scars. But his touch was impossibly careful as he gently lifted the quilt and tucked it back over the children. She stared up at him, blinking against the falling snow. He met her gaze, his expression unchanging, silent. Then he reached forward. He didn't just pick her up. He scooped up all 3 of them, her, Joey, Elsie, the quilt, all of it, as if they weighed no more than a bundle of firewood. Her vision blurred as he turned and started walking back toward the dark wall of trees, his steps steady and sure, never faltering in the deep snow. Belle didn't know where he was taking them. She didn't know who he was or what he might want. All she knew, as the snow blurred the world into an endless, swirling white, was that for the first time in days, someone had seen her, and they hadn't looked away. She let the darkness come then, but this time it came without fear. The wind groaned against the cabin walls. It sounded like an old widow weeping for the world, but inside it was dim and silent, save for the soft hiss of water warming over a fire and the quiet, even breaths of sleeping children. Belle's eyes opened slowly. Her head was resting on a pillow of soft fur. Her body ached in ways she hadn't even known were possible. For a long, confused moment, she couldn't tell if she was alive or if this was some strange, warm dream before death. The last thing she remembered was the sting of snow on her eyelashes and the sight of a shape rising from the blizzard like a walking mountain. Now she was somewhere dry, somewhere warm. The air smelled of pine smoke, of tanned hide, and of unfamiliar herbs that were sharp and clean. She sat up too fast. Pain bloomed in her chest, and the small one-room cabin spun around her. Her hand shot out, driven by a raw, animal instinct of fear, and landed on soft wool. Two small bodies were tucked in beside her, wrapped tight in heavy, warm blankets. Joey's dark curls were pressed against her shoulder. Elsie's face was burrowed into her hip, her little hand still clutching a piece of Belle's dress. They were warm. They were breathing. A breath she didn't know she was holding escaped her in a shaky sigh. Her hands trembled. And that's when she noticed the other presence. Across the room, seated on a low stool near the hearth, the man was watching her. He was silent, utterly still. He was unlike any man she had ever seen. He was as broad as the doorframe he must have had to duck to enter. His shoulders were wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide lined with soft rabbit fur. His dark hair, thick and straight, hung loose to his shoulders, except for two slender braids near his temples, tied with simple rawhide. His face was stoic, but not hard. It was a landscape of high cheekbones, a strong nose, and eyes that flickered with something she couldn't name. It wasn't danger. It wasn't pity. It was something older, wiser, and maybe wounded. She froze, pulling the children even closer, a mother bear protecting her cubs. He didn't speak. The fire popped once, throwing a splash of red light across his jaw. She saw a thin, pale scar that ran from just beneath his left ear down to his collarbone. His eyes, so dark they were almost black, never left hers. He made no move toward her, no gesture of ownership or threat. He was just watching, measuring. Her voice, when it finally came, cracked like dry wood. Who are you?" Still, he said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Joey stirred beside her, his fingers clutching hers in his sleep. She smoothed his hair, her eyes never leaving the man. "Why did you bring us here?" She tried again. This time, he moved. He stood up, and he did it without a sound, without any hurry. He crossed to a rough-hewn shelf in the corner. He picked up a wooden bowl and used a ladle to fill it with a dark, steaming broth from a kettle hanging over the fire. He walked toward her, his steps slow and cautious, the way you'd approach a skittish colt that had been mistreated. He crouched down a few feet away from her and held the bowl out, not too close, not demanding. It was an offering. Belle stared at it. A part of her, the part that had been fed on fear and suspicion her whole life, wanted to slap it away, to scream, to demand answers, but her stomach betrayed her. It growled, a loud, embarrassing rumble in the quiet room. Her hand reached out reluctantly, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, but his hand was steady. The bowl was warm in her palms. She lifted it and sipped. The broth was savory, a little bitter, heavy with the taste of roots and herbs she didn't recognize, but it was life-giving. It was the warmest thing she had felt in days, and it spread through her veins like a prayer being answered. She glanced at him again over the rim of the bowl. "You speak English?" There was a pause. Then, one soft word that settled like a stone in the silence. "Yes." She stared at him, trying to read him. What did he want? People didn't do things for nothing. Not in her world. What do you want from us? Another long pause. He seemed to consider the question carefully. Nothing. She blinked, confused. You found us, she said slowly, trying to piece it together. By the creek. He nodded once, a small, sharp movement of his head. I thought we were going to die. You nearly did. His voice was low and grainy, like boots crunching on gravel, but there was a gentleness to it. No edge, no superiority, just a statement of fact. She lowered the bowl, the warmth giving her a sliver of courage. Why help us? He looked away from her then, toward the fire. He stared into the flames for a long time before he answered. When he spoke, his words struck something deep inside her. Because I have been cold before. It wasn't a story. It wasn't an explanation meant to impress her. It was just the truth, plain and sharp and utterly real. The fire crackled again, filling the silence. Joey murmured something inaudible in his sleep, and she brushed his cheek gently. When she looked up, the man had stepped back to the hearth, squatting down to stir the broth with the quiet care of someone who was tending to more than just food. I'm Belle, she said softly. Belle Wynne. That's Elsie, and that's Joey. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. And you are? She asked. He stirred the broth once more, then set the ladle down. Tahi. She waited, but no surname followed. Apache? She asked, the word feeling clumsy and loaded in her mouth. It was a word used as a curse back in town. He looked at her then, and she didn't see offense in his eyes. She saw something quieter, resignation. I was, he said. The town's warnings, all the half-truths and whispered stories about the savages in the woods, echoed in her mind. She'd never known anyone to even speak with an Apache, let alone be saved by one. I won't stay long, she said, feeling a sudden need to make things clear. Just until the snow lightens. You will stay until the children can walk strong again. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even kindness. It was, like everything else about him, simply a fact. She found herself nodding in agreement. Outside, the wind howled, a wounded beast circling the small, warm cabin. Inside, the firelight danced on stone walls, on skin and fur. Belle's body was finally giving in to exhaustion, but her mind was still alert, curled up like a cautious cat in a corner. She laid the children gently back down on the bed of hides. When she turned, Tahi was already across the room, unrolling another thick pelt for himself. He placed it by the wall, near the door, in the coldest part of the cabin. He would not share the bed. He would not take. He would not even watch her sleep. That simple choice, to sleep near the drafty door, in the path of the wind, rather than near the warmth of the fire with her, spoke more loudly than any words he could have said. She curled up beside her children, the taste of the broth still on her tongue. She was still wary, but for the first time in a very long time, she was no longer afraid. Morning came pale and bitter. The snow had finally stopped, but it had left the world buried and silent. Outside the cabin's single small window, the forest was a thick, impenetrable wall of white and black. Tahi had already been out. He stepped back inside without a sound, a freshly caught rabbit in one hand and his bow in the other. He skinned it near the fire with a practiced, economical grace. Not a single motion was wasted. Belle watched him, sitting up in the furs, unsure of what her role was. Should she help? Should she stay out of the way? He never asked for her help. He never asked for her trust. He just moved gently through the space around her fear, until that fear began to fray at the edges, worn down by his quiet, consistent decency. That afternoon, while the rabbit stewed, he took a small piece of wood and his knife and began to carve. An hour later, he walked over to Joey. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He just placed a small, perfectly carved wooden whistle in the boy's hands and stepped away. Joey, still shy and overwhelmed, didn't blow it. He just clutched it in his fist as if it were treasure. The next day, Elsie, who had found a piece of charcoal from the fire and a smooth piece of birch bark, drew a picture. It was a crooked, stick-like figure, but it was tall, with big hands and a wobbly line for a smile. She shyly held it out to Tahi. He took it from her, his large, scarred hands incredibly gentle. He nodded solemnly, studying the drawing as if it were a masterpiece. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and serious. Belle saw it then. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it came on slowly, like a sunrise over a field of snow. It was small, and it was earned. The days fell into a quiet rhythm. Tahi would hunt. Belle would cook and mend their tattered clothes with thread he provided. The children, seeing their mother was no longer terrified, began to thaw. They would play near the hearth, their quiet laughter filling the small cabin with a sound it had probably never heard before. One night, after the children were asleep, the fire had faded to a bed of glowing embers. The sky pressed black and star-filled against the window. Belle couldn't sleep. She sat near the hearth, her fingers tracing the worn cover of Asa's pocket Bible, which she'd rescued from the crate. "You live alone?" she asked into the quiet. "Yes," Tahi answered from the other side of the fire. "For how long?" "Long time." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in her heart. "Did you lose someone?" His eyes, which had been on the fire, flicked toward her. He used a stick to stir the embers, watching them blink like tired red stars. "My sister," he said finally, his voice flat. "A long time ago." Belle waited, holding her breath. "They came in blue coats," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Took her away. I was a boy. I ran." Belle's breath caught in her throat. The casual cruelty of it, spoken so plainly. "I have looked for her face in dreams for 20 winters," he added, still staring into the fire. And there it was, the hidden spring that fed the deep, quiet river of his sadness. This was the reason for the gentleness, the reason for the solitude, the reason a man would walk out into a blizzard to rescue a strange woman and her children, and then ask for nothing in return. He was looking for his sister in the face of every lost soul he found. Belle looked down at the flickering embers. Her hand rested on the wooden floor, close to his, but not touching. She didn't know what would come next for her and her children. She didn't know if this broken world had a place for them anymore, but she knew this much. In the dark, in a forgotten cabin buried in the snow, 2 broken hearts had just spoken to each other, and neither one had turned away. Something was changing inside her. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by something else, something hard and clear. When she'd packed to leave the homestead, she hadn't brought hope. But now, it seemed she had found some anyway. She looked over at Tahi, who was still staring at the fire as if seeing ghosts in the flames. He thought he was alone, but he wasn't. Not anymore. And as she watched him, a strange thought came to her. She looked down at the Bible in her lap. Asa had read from it every night. But in his last few weeks, he'd been different. Quiet. Secretive. He kept looking towards the woods, towards the creek where Tahi had found them. On impulse, Belle opened the book. The pages were worn, filled with his faint pencil marks. She idly flipped through them, not looking for anything in particular. Then her fingers brushed against something thick. A page near the back, in the Book of Revelation, was stuck to the cover. It had been glued down carefully along the edges. Her heart started to beat a little faster. This wasn't Asa's way. He treated this book like it was sacred. He would never deface it. With trembling fingers, she worked a fingernail under the corner of the page and pulled. The old glue gave way with a faint tearing sound. It wasn't a page from the Bible. It was a separate piece of paper, folded small and thin, tucked into a hollowed-out space beneath. It was a letter, written in Asa's familiar, spidery hand. But it wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to Levi. "Brother," it began, "if you are reading this, then my time has come, and yours is about to begin. You have what you wanted, the house, the land, the name. All I ask is that you show my Belle and the children the kindness you never showed me. Do not let your greed poison everything we built. Remember the agreement. The stone by the creek is the marker. What lies beneath is not yours. It was never ours. It is a debt that must be paid. Belle's blood ran cold. What agreement? What debt? The stone by the creek. The same creek where she had collapsed. The same place Tahi had found them. It couldn't be a coincidence. Levi hadn't found this letter, which meant he didn't know it existed. But he knew about the agreement. He knew about the stone. That must be why he was so quick to cast them out. He wanted them gone so he could go to that creek and claim whatever was hidden there. But there was another, more chilling possibility. The letter spoke of Asa's time coming. It sounded like he knew he was dying. But he hadn't been sick for long. It had come on so suddenly. Do not let your greed poison everything. Poison. A terrible, sickening suspicion began to form in her mind. What if Asa's sickness wasn't a sickness at all? She looked up at Tahi. He was still watching the fire, lost in his own world of grief. He had no idea that she held a piece of paper that might connect them all, her, him, Asa, and the cruel man who had sent her out to die. The world had just cracked open, and she was falling right through. The road to town was a scar of packed-down snow cutting through the white wilderness. Belle could feel its judgment long before the first crooked rooftops of the town came into view. The cold in the air had softened, but the cold in people's hearts, she knew, was a permanent winter. Joey sat perched on Tahi's broad shoulders, his little hands gripping Tahi's braids, like they were the reins of the strongest horse in the world. Elsie, her hand wrapped in a piece of borrowed fur, clutched Belle's fingers tightly. The snow squeaked under their boots, a lonely, rhythmic sound. The closer they got to town, the heavier the air felt. It was as if an unseen storm of gossip and suspicion was gathering just around the next bend. Tahi said little. His frame towered over hers, a silent mountain of a man. He wore no feathers, no war paint, just his thick coat of buffalo hide and the bone-handled knife at his belt. But his presence alone was a statement. It was a challenge to the small, pinched world they were about to enter. The first eyes found them just past the old, skeletal cottonwood where a horse thief had been hanged last spring. Two boys, sledding on a hill, stopped dead. Their laughter died in their throats. One of them dropped the rope to his sled and ran, scrambling toward the general store, his voice shrill and panicked. "Ma! Ma! It's that Apache giant! And he's got the widow!" Belle's throat tightened. The widow, not Belle, not Mrs. Wynne, just the widow. An object, a problem, a piece of property that had somehow gotten loose. Mrs. Pringle was already standing outside the dry goods store, her arms folded like the wings of some frozen bird of prey. Her gaze, sharp and cruel, slid over Tahi like he was something unclean, then landed on Belle. Finally, her eyes dropped to the children. "Well, I'll be," she said, her lips pursed into a tight knot of disapproval. "Didn't expect to see you walking tall again, Mrs. Wynne. Thought you'd taken to dying quiet in the woods." Belle lifted her chin, refusing to let the woman see her flinch. "We needed supplies." Mrs. Pringle sniffed, a sound of pure contempt. "Is that what they're calling it now?" Her eyes flickered to Tahi again. Running off with one of them in the dead of winter. No husband, 2 mouths to feed, no proper witness to what's gone on out there in those woods. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "The Lord sees, girl, even if the law don't." Tahi said nothing. He didn't even seem to be breathing. His stillness was a blade in its sheath, quiet, but you knew it was sharp. "Let's go," Belle murmured, pushing past the old woman and into the store. The bell above the door tinkled, its cheerful sound completely out of place in the suffocating atmosphere. Inside, Sheriff Avery was leaning against the counter, sorting through some ledgers. He looked up slowly, his eyes tired. He was a man caught between law and public opinion, and it wore on him. His gaze settled on Belle first, then on the silent giant beside her. His jaw shifted. It wasn't hostile, just cautious. "Mrs. Wynne," he said, his voice flat. "Been a while." Belle nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel every eye in the store on her. Young Emery Bowl, the clerk, was pretending to stack cans, but his hands were shaking. "We'd like flour, salt, and some thread," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And if you have any dried peaches, I'd like those too." The sheriff looked at the children, hiding behind her skirts, then at Tahi. "You folks staying with Mr. Tahi?" "He brought us in from the creek," Belle said, choosing her words carefully. "He saved our lives." A long beat of silence passed. The sheriff just looked at her. "You all right?" "We're alive," she answered. It was the only truth that mattered. "There's been talk," he said, his voice low. "There's always talk," she replied, a new hardness in her tone. He didn't argue with that. Emery Bowl bagged the flour without ever making eye contact. His hands fumbled as he measured out the salt. Belle pulled out the small leather pouch Tahi had given her. It contained a few coins he'd gotten from trading pelts. "I've coin," she said loudly, placing it on the counter. "Earned honest." Just as she was gathering her parcels, the door swung open again, and her blood turned to ice. It was Levi. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light, his arms folded, his face carved from the same cold stone as his barn foundation. He didn't look at Tahi. He looked right through Belle. "Well," he said, his voice dry and full of malice. "Look what the snow coughed up." Belle stopped, her hand frozen over the bag of flour. "You should have stayed dead, girl," he added, his voice low enough so only she could hear. And that's when Tahi moved. It was just one step forward. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. But the sound of his single boot hitting the wooden floorboards made everything else in the world go silent. The wind seemed to pause. Even Levi blinked. "Stay," Belle whispered, placing her hand on Tahi's powerful arm. She could feel the tension in him, like a coiled spring. Levi saw her touch him, and a cruel smirk twisted his lips. "You think that thing is going to protect you? You're a win by marriage, girl, which means now you're nothing." Something inside Belle, something that had been frozen for years, finally snapped. "I was nothing under your roof," she said, her voice gaining a strength that surprised even her. "You let us starve. You left Asa to rot without a shred of dignity. You turned your back before the ground over his grave was even frozen." Levi's face darkened with rage. He took a step closer. "You shame this town, living out there with that." He spat the word out. Suddenly he lunged. Not for Tahi, for her. He tried to grab the parcels from her hands. "That's my money you're spending. That's my brother's charity." But before he could touch her, Tahi's hand shot out. He didn't grab Levi's arm. He just opened his hand and placed it flat against Levi's chest. It was not a violent move, but it stopped Levi dead in his tracks, as if he had run into a stone wall. "The money is mine," Tahi said, his voice a low rumble. "The woman is not yours to command." Levi stared, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. He looked to the sheriff for help. "You just going to let this stand, Avery? He put his hands on me." Sheriff Avery sighed, pushing himself off the counter. "Looked to me like you were the one causing the disturbance, Levi." But it was Joey who spoke next. His small, clear voice cut through the tension from his safe perch on Tahi's shoulders. "You're mean," he said simply. "You made Mama cry." A few of the onlookers, farmers who had known Asa, shifted uncomfortably. A low chuckle rippled through the store. Levi's face turned a deep, blotchy red. He was being shamed, and he couldn't stand it. He stepped back, pointing a trembling finger at Belle. "You'll regret this. All of you." Belle looked him straight in the eye, the secret letter from Asa burning a hole in her pocket. "No, Levi," she said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "I already regretted you, and now I'm done." She turned, gathered her things, and with Tahi at her side and her children safe, she walked out of the store and back into the clean, cold air. She didn't look back. As they crossed the bridge out of town, she noticed Tahi had slowed his pace just a little to match hers. He said nothing, but he didn't have to. Back at the cabin, the sun was melting into a pool of pink and orange behind the black teeth of the pines. Belle unpacked the supplies in silence while Tahi rebuilt the fire. The children, released from the tension of the town, were outside, their laughter soft and brave as they played with sticks in the snow. Belle held the bag of dried peaches. It was a luxury, a foolish expense. But she had wanted them to have something sweet. "Thank you," she said, not looking up from where she was arranging the food on the shelf. "For coming with me." Tahi paused, holding a piece of kindling in his palm as if it were something precious. "I would not let you walk into that alone." "You didn't have to," she whispered. He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious. "I did." The cabin was small and the walls were thin, but in that moment, it felt larger and safer than any house she had ever lived in. Later, as the fire danced and the shadows grew long, she pulled the folded letter from her pocket. Her hand was trembling. "Tahi," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something you need to see." He came and sat near her, his presence solid and comforting in the flickering light. She unfolded the brittle paper and held it out to him. "I found this in my husband's Bible." Tahi took the letter. He could not read the words, but he recognized the name Levi and the shape of the land drawn crudely at the bottom. He looked at her, his eyes asking the question. It says Asa made an agreement with Levi," she explained, her voice shaking. "About a stone by the creek. It says what's under it isn't theirs, that it's a debt that has to be paid." Tahi's face, usually so unreadable, hardened. A flicker of something, recognition, pain, anger, passed through his eyes. He looked from the letter to her, and then back to the letter. "The stone by the creek," he said, his voice a low growl. "It is a grave." Belle felt the blood drain from her face. "A grave? Whose grave?" "My father's," Tahi said, and the whole world tilted on its axis. "Your husband, Asa. He found my father years ago, after he was left for dead by raiders. Asa hid him, brought him food. He tried to save him, but the wounds were too deep. Before he died, my father told Asa where our people had buried our silver, a few things we had saved. It was meant to be an offering, a trade for safe passage." He pointed to the letter. "Asa knew. He was a good man. He promised my father he would protect it, that it was a debt. He was trying to give it back to my people." Belle's mind was reeling. Levi. Levi knew about this? "Levi's father was one of the raiders," Tahi said, and the words fell like stones into the silence. "Levi knew about the silver. He has been looking for it his whole life. He thought Asa knew where it was. He thought Asa was keeping it from him." Suddenly, it all made a horrific, sickening sense. Levi's resentment of Asa, his greed, the way he had isolated them, and Asa's sickness. "Oh God," Belle whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "The letter says, 'Do not let your greed poison everything.'" Tahi's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw the terrible truth dawning. Asa hadn't gotten sick. Levi had made sure of it. He had poisoned his own brother, believing that Asa's death would give him free rein to find the silver. He'd cast Belle and the children out not just out of cruelty, but to get them away from the creek, away from the stone marker, so he could tear up the land and find his treasure. But he had miscalculated. He had sent her out to die in the one place where she would be found by the one man who knew the truth. She wasn't just a widow. She was a witness. And the man sitting across from her wasn't just her rescuer. He was the key to everything. The storm moved in quietly, like a secret that had been kept for too long. Wind braided itself through the pines and the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, burying the world in a fresh blanket of white. But inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was raging. Belle sat staring into the fire, the letter from Asa lying open in her lap. The truth of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her husband hadn't just died. He had been murdered by his own brother, and she had sat by his bed, helpless, blaming God, blaming fate, when the real poison was sitting at the dinner table with them every single night. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like the calm eye of a hurricane. Outside, Levi was hunting for silver. Inside, she held the proof of his crime. Tahi sat across from her, his face a mask of stone. He was polishing his bone-handled knife with a piece of soft leather, his movements slow and deliberate. But his eyes were fixed on the fire, and she knew he was seeing not just the flames, but the faces of his father, his lost sister, the ghosts of a life that had been stolen from him. "He killed him," Belle whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "For money, for a handful of silver, he killed his own brother." Tahi didn't look at her. He just kept polishing the blade, back and forth, a steady, rhythmic motion. "Greed is a sickness," he said, his voice low. "It eats a man from the inside out." "Asa tried to protect you," she said, looking at Tahi. "He was trying to protect your family's legacy, this debt in the letter. He was trying to do what was right." "He was a good man," Tahi said simply, "different from the others." The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. Pain was a language, and they had both become fluent in it. They were two survivors of the same man's evil, their paths thrown together by a twist of fate that now felt like destiny. Elsie murmured in her sleep and rolled over, her small hand brushing against Belle's leg. Belle reached down and stroked her daughter's hair, a fierce, protective love rising in her like a tide. These children were all she had left of Asa, and Levi had tried to take them from her too. He had tried to erase them all, but he had failed. I can't let him get away with it," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that was cold and pure. "I can't let him win." Tahi finally stopped polishing the knife. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "What would you have me do?" "I don't know," she admitted, her mind racing. "The letter. It's just my word against his. The sheriff is a cautious man. He won't act without more proof." "Proof is sometimes buried," Tahi said, his gaze distant. She thought of the stone by the creek, the grave. What if the proof was there? What if Levi had been careless? What if something of the poison, the container, anything, was still there? It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all she had. "He'll be looking for it," she said. "The silver. He'll be tearing up the ground around that creek." "Let him look," Tahi said, a strange, grim light in his eyes. "The ground is frozen hard. It will take him time, and he will be distracted." A plan began to form in Belle's mind, a dangerous, reckless idea born of grief and fury. She looked at Tahi, at his quiet strength, at the shared history of pain that now bound them together. "You know this land better than anyone," she said. "You know how to move without being seen. You could watch him." Tahi nodded slowly. "I could." "And I," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I will not hide in this cabin waiting for him to find us. Asa bought a piece of land before he died. He never told me about it, but I found the deed with his papers. It's a small parcel, up on the ridge, high ground. He must have bought it for us, a place to escape Levi." She stood up, pacing the small space in front of the fire. "We're not going to run. We're not going to hide. We're going to build, right under his nose, on that ridge. We will build a new home, a place where he can't touch us. We will build it in plain sight as a statement. We are still here. We survived." It was a crazy idea. 2 people and 2 small children building a cabin in the dead of winter, with a murderer on the loose. But for the first time since Asa died, Belle felt a flicker of hope. Not the soft, gentle hope of a prayer, but the hard, sharp-edged hope of a weapon being forged. Tahi watched her, his expression unreadable. She stopped pacing and faced him directly. "He thinks I'm weak," she said. He thinks you're just a savage hiding in the woods. He thinks we're victims. We have to show him he's wrong." Tahi stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He walked to the door and cracked it open, letting a blast of cold air and swirling snow rush in. He looked out into the white, howling darkness. "Firelight doesn't lie," he said, repeating the words he had spoken to her before. "It shows what is really there." He turned back to face her, and for the first time, she saw something more than just sadness in his eyes. She saw a warrior's resolve. "We will build a fire so bright he cannot ignore it." He reached out and gently took the letter from her hand. He folded it carefully and tucked it inside his shirt. "I will watch him," he said. "You will build, and when the time is right, we will show the sheriff and the whole world what kind of man Levi Wynn truly is." He then did something that stunned her. He reached out and placed his large, warm hand on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of alliance, a promise. "You are not a widow," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You are a warrior, Belle, and you will not fight alone." That night, Belle did not dream of Asa's death. She dreamed of fire. A great roaring bonfire on a high ridge, its flames reaching up to touch the stars. And she was the one who had lit it. The sun rose low and gold, setting the fresh snow alight like a field of scattered diamonds. Belle stood outside the small cabin, a rifle slung over her shoulder. It was Tahi's spare rifle, heavy and solid. He had spent the last week teaching her how to use it. Her hands were no longer soft and delicate. They were chapped and strong, calloused from chopping wood and hauling stones. The children were gathering rocks for a fire ring, their cheeks red from the cold, their breath steaming in the crisp morning air. They were not building at the old cabin site. They had moved everything, piece by piece, to the plot of land on the ridge Asa had secretly bought. Her land. It was not a place to hide. It was a fortress. It had a clear view of the trail below, the same trail Levi would have to use to get to the creek. They would see him coming long before he saw them. The new cabin was halfway done. The walls were framed with logs Tahi had felled, the scent of fresh-cut pine sharp and clean in the air. They had dug a root cellar into the hillside and marked off a small plot that, come spring, would be a garden. It was more than a shelter. It was a declaration of war. She saw him before she heard him. Tahi stepped out of the tree line, moving with the silent grace of a shadow. He had 2 split logs balanced on one shoulder, and his bow and quiver strapped to his back. He wore no coat, just a thick woven shirt, and the calm, steady focus of a man on a mission. His eyes found hers across the clearing. No words passed between them, but a whole conversation took place in that one look. "He's coming." The sound came a few minutes later. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several, moving fast, kicking up snow, then voices, sharp and angry, carried on the wind. Belle moved to stand beside Tahi, her hand resting on the cold steel of the rifle. The children, sensing the change in the air, ran to her, hiding behind her skirts. 5 riders broke through the trees. At their head was Levi Wynn, his face a mask of self-righteous fury. He had convinced himself that he was the wronged party, that this was his land, his silver, his world to command. Behind him rode Sheriff Avery, his face grim and reluctant. The other 3 were ranch hands from the Wynn property, men who had known Asa, men who looked uneasy and out of place. Levi reined in his horse and dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep snow. His eyes raked over the half-finished cabin, the neat pile of firewood, the determined woman and the silent Apache standing before it. "You don't waste time," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt, barely out of the ground and already playing house. "It's not a game, Levi," Belle said, her voice calm and clear as a winter morning. "You're on Winland," he roared. "No, I'm not," she replied evenly. "This ridge is past your claim line. I checked the map at the county office. This is my land now, bought and paid for by my husband." Levi faltered for a second. He looked back at the sheriff, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She's right, Levi. Her name's on the deed. Levi's face curdled with rage. You think a few furs and a savage makes you strong, Belle? Tahi took a half-step forward, his hand drifting down toward the knife at his belt, but Belle touched his arm gently. Stay. She looked straight at Levi. No, she said. I think surviving what you did to me makes me strong. Levi's eyes widened. What I did? I gave you a roof over your head. You left me to die in a blizzard, she shot back, her voice rising. You left my children to freeze. You watched my husband waste away and did nothing. One of the ranch hands, a younger man with kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He looked down at his horse, unable to meet Belle's gaze. Levi ignored him. He sneered at Belle. You shamed the family name. That's Asa's blood you're dragging through the mud. Asa's blood wouldn't have left a widow in the snow, she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Asa's blood ran warm, Levi, not bitter and cold like yours. He took a step toward the cabin, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. I'm tearing this down. In a single fluid motion, Tahi moved between Levi and the cabin. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stood there, a silent, immovable mountain. His presence was like thunder held in bone. Levi hesitated, his hand hovering over his gun. Move, you filth, he growled. This fire is not for you, Tahi said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a rockslide. Are you threatening me? Levi blustered, trying to regain his footing. No, Tahi said. I am reminding you what silence is worth, and what it costs. Sheriff Avery finally spoke up, his voice tired. Let's not do this, boys. There's no call for it. There's every call for it, Levi shouted, his composure finally cracking. She's turned my brother's children against me. She's living up here in sin with this creature. It ain't right. You want to talk about what's right, Levi? Belle said, taking a step forward. She raised the rifle, not pointing it at him, but holding it across her chest like a shield. Let's talk about Asa. Let's talk about his sickness. Levi went pale. What about it? It came on so fast, didn't it? 1 week he was fine, the next he couldn't breathe. I remember you bringing him a special tonic. You said it was an old family recipe. The younger ranch hand's head shot up. His eyes were wide with panic. You told me the doctor was a waste of money, Belle continued, her voice ringing with accusation. You told me to let the sickness run its course. He was weak, Levi stammered. No, Belle said. He was trusting. He trusted his own brother. She took another step forward. Tell me, Levi, what was in that tonic? Levi was cornered. He glanced around wildly, looking for support, but the other men were just staring at him, suspicion dawning on their faces. And then, the young ranch hand, the one with the kind eyes, spoke up. His voice was trembling. Sheriff, I saw him. All eyes turned to the young man. Saw who, son? The sheriff asked gently. I saw Mr. Levi, the boy stammered. A few days before Mr. Asa passed. He was down by the creek. He had a small bottle. He was washing it out. I didn't think nothing of it at the time, but... Levi lunged for his gun. You shut your mouth! But he never cleared the leather. With a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, Tahi crossed the space between them. He didn't hit Levi. He didn't tackle him. He simply grabbed Levi's gun hand, his fingers like bands of steel. Levi cried out in pain and the pistol clattered uselessly into the snow. At the same time, Belle raised her rifle and fired into the air. The shot echoed across the ridge, a deafening crack that shattered the winter silence. It was a signal, a warning, a final, definitive statement. Sheriff Avery drew his own weapon and pointed it at Levi. Don't move, Levi. It's over. Levi stared at Belle, his face a twisted mess of hatred and disbelief. You'll regret this. Belle lowered the rifle, her heart pounding but her hands steady. She looked at the man who had tormented her, who had murdered her husband, who had tried to destroy her family, and she felt nothing but a cold, empty pity. No, Levi, she said, her voice as soft as the falling snow. I regretted you for a long time. And now? I'm letting you go." The sheriff holstered his weapon and pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. As he clamped them around Levi's wrists, he looked over at Belle, a new respect in his tired eyes. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Wynne." "My name is Belle," she said. He tipped his hat to her. "That it is." As they led Levi away, a broken and defeated man, Tahi walked over to Belle. The children ran into her arms and she held them tight, burying her face in their hair. It was over. It was finally over. She looked up at Tahi, who stood watching them, his dark eyes filled with a quiet emotion she couldn't quite name. "He didn't find the silver, did he?" she asked. Tahi shook his head. "There is no silver," he said softly. Belle stared at him, confused. "But the letter. Your father." "My father told Asa a story to make him protect his grave," Tahi explained. "The only thing buried under that stone is my father's body. The only treasure was his honor, a treasure Levi could never understand and would never find." The final lie, the final perfect piece of justice. Levi had destroyed his life, murdered his brother, for a ghost, for a story. Belle started to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into a full, cathartic laugh that echoed across the ridge. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, washing away the last of the fear, the last of the grief. They stood there for a long time, the four of them, in front of their unfinished home, as the snow continued to fall, burying the past and making the world clean and new again. The fire in the stone ring crackled merrily, sending sparks up into the endless blue sky. They were not just survivors, they were founders. And this was just the beginning. If you were on the edge of your seat watching Belle's journey from victim to warrior, hit that subscribe button. Because the darkness has more stories to tell, and justice sometimes builds its own home in the wild.